Emily Miller of the Washington Times is in studio with us. How you doing, Emily?
It's good to be here.
It's great to have you. And part 4 of your 4-part series in how D.C. Treating our nation's veterans is just out. And I got to tell you, I mean, these stories, you know, the series that you wrote about becoming a gun owner in Washington, D.C. was bad enough. But you know, the stories that you have uncovered of how the district are treating our soldiers who've gone off to war, who've defended our freedoms, and then are being thrown in jail for breaking no laws, or for you know, in this particular case, breaking a law that only exists on the books in Washington D.C. and New York City, Chicago. These anti-gun bastions.
That's right.
Violating D.C.'s gun registration laws. So tell me, what did you? I mean, you're talking about a cover-up in the arrest of this sergeant, right?
Right, yeah, and DC won't deny that. So we've been talking about the case of Sergeant Matt Corrigan, first sergeant, U.S. Army. He's a reservist. He volunteered to go to Iraq for a year and served in outside. So it was embedded with the Iraqi army, and he was, in charge of like going out on patrols and looking for IED and all this like extremely dangerous, scary stuff, and was such a hero. And so anyway, came back and moved into DC and didn't register his 3 personal guns. So this is how this all started, and you followed the case, what I've written about so far. That he was woke up middle of the night, forced out of his home, arrested, handcuffed, hand-tied, I should say, and then the cops put in a SWAT team and raided his home and tore it apart and found these 3 guns, the so-called dangerous weapons, and and you read about last week's story. They put him in jail ended up being 2 weeks without a hearing. He had a hearing after 4 days, but it was in jail for 4 days without a hearing at all, and then ended up being in jail for 2 weeks because they lost him in the system.
That's amazing. They had
It's
they had his
horrible.
wrong birthday?
Wrong birthday, wrong name on his tags, and so his prison ID number couldn't be identified. So his girlfriend and his family, his mother, they couldn't find him, and he couldn't get a lawyer, so he had a public defender who let him get remanded back into the system and lost again. And it's like it's sort of I say it's like everyone's worst fear when you have an interaction with the cops is that you're going to get arrested and put in jail, and then it's just like it's like why we get so scared when we get pulled over, and it's like this everyone's worst fear is you'll go to jail, and then on top of that your worst fear is these horror stories where you either wrongly put in jail or you get lost in the system and nobody knows how to get you out. I mean, you have nightmares like this, and this guy Matt Corrigan is such a sweet man and such a good hero and brave, and served our country so nobly, and just being treated like this. And he's still active. I mean, in fact, next week he leaves for his 2 weeks reservist training. So he's still active in the military. And what's ridiculous about this whole thing with DC is that these veterans, and we talked about the case of Augustine Kim recently, another veteran who was arrested in D.C. and thrown in jail for having guns, in fact, his case completely legally in D.C., transporting them, is that these men their full-time job is this. Our government pays them to carry guns, to shoot, shoot, to be in the military. I mean, this is their jobs, and then they go into the nation's capital, which is where their orders are coming from, and get thrown in jail for that exact same thing. It's just the stupidest thing. And, as you well know, that recently the House passed a non-binding amendment that in this case probably won't get past the Senate, but a non-binding amendment, the Gingrelli Amendment, that would make anyone who's serving in the military or stationed in D.C. or living in D.C. to be exempt from these ridiculous registration laws and carry laws, and I think
carry laws as well.
It would be exempt from all the D.C. laws. D.C. firearms laws, and it gets a sense of Congress, so it's non-binding. But I think it gives a good sense of where the country is going with this, with the way that our nation's capital is what they're doing to our soldiers and our veterans, versus what should be done. And like you said, it's only Chicago, New York City, Washington, D.C., and Hawaii that make you register every single solitary gun with the government. So the government knows every gun you have.
Right.
It's only these like obscure, very hard liberal places that do it. It's not common in the rest of the country, and quite frankly, don't think it'll be held up in courts as it moves forward. Anyway, so finishing up the case of Sergeant Corrigan, when the cops arrested him and raided his house, they didn't stop and get a warrant, neither for his arrest nor for going in his home. They just went in. They asked him for his key. He said no. And they said, then we're going to break. Don't give me this constitutional BS. We'll break down your door.
Don't give me any of this constitutional BS.
That's what the commander said to him.
Yay, in Washington.
Because he said, you're right. He said, I'm not allowing you to go into my home. And he said, then don't give me this constitutional BS. We'll break down your door, and you'll have to buy a new door. And Sergeant Corrigan, who, I mean, I can't imagine I'd be this clear thinking at waking up from the dead of sleep at 4 a.m., walk outside to find red dots all over my chest because of all the, police who are holding automatic guns on his chest.
Right.
And for doing nothing. And I would not be so clear thinking to, say you can't go in my house. But glad he did. And after being zip tied and put into a commanding truck. So they did. They barreled down his door. And obviously afterwards they're in a load of trouble because we do, although DC doesn't really care so much about the Second Amendment, they seemingly don't really care about the Fourth either, but it does exist, and you're supposed to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, and they didn't seem to want to go to the court and get a warrant, even though there was nothing going on. So after the case, when he got rid of the public defender and got a real attorney, Richard Gardner, as you will know him very well, and is often on your show and is like the best firearms attorney. Like you get Richard Gardner when these kinds of things happen, and so Gardner says to the district attorney or the attorney general in D.C., well, okay. And what basis were these searches with these 3 illegal guns, supposedly illegal guns, which were, by the way, after all this, they were encased, they were in bottom of closets, like they were not, no one was getting hurt that night from a gun, except for the police guns. So, and then the attorney general said to him, it was exigent circumstances. And actually the cops came to her and said it's exigent circumstances. There was a smell of gas, and he was trained in booby traps, in creating booby traps. This was his military training. So this is what they said. And one of the heads, Lieutenant Robert Glover, wrote this report while Sergeant Corrigan was sitting in jail, wrote this report and started this whole saga, this fabrication of these exigent circumstances to Police Chief Kathy Lanier. So this was at the highest levels, these exigent circumstances. So Gardner said to the Attorney General, okay, well, let me see where you have it, where it says that there was a smell of natural gas. And she sent some documents over, and it wasn't in there. And he said, well, it says here that they had Washington Gas turn off the gas in the building. It's 2 a.m., 2 hours before the raid. Oh, well, that wasn't in there. And nowhere in all the police notes from that night, which he made her turn over in discovery, was there any mention of the smell of gas. None. And then he has the neighbor who lives upstairs say in the hearing they had later, what happened. She said, the police came to me and said they smelled gas. I need to get out of my house. And the police said to her that night, she said, and I said to the police, if you're smelling anything, you're smelling chicken parmesan because my roommate's cooking. But, Matt, who's lived in the basement, he doesn't have gas in his, it's only electricity down there. There is no gas. And they had turned off the gas. So this was obviously completely made up. The second thing the cops came up with is that he was trained in booby traps. And they actually used that phrase throughout this report to Kathy Lanier, booby traps, which, I don't even know if that's like a real thing in the military. Like, I don't think they train in booby traps. But anyway, so then they said, where did you get this? And so Gardner asked the Attorney General, and she said, from the police. And the police, back and forth. There's nothing except for this one report written a week later. There's nothing to say that there's any. First of all, he wasn't trained in quote booby trap. He's not he wasn't trained to like set things off and blow things up.
Right.
And
he's not a demolitions expert, right?
No. Granted, he served in Iraq and was looking for IEDs to take apart, but he's not a terrorist. So that quickly fell apart. So by the time that came around to 2012, this year, the Attorney General's office filed something with the court saying we're pulling out, and to their credit, said we're withdrawing our case both on the natural gas and the booby traps because there are none. So by the time they got to hearing in April of this year, which has been 2 years later, the case, obviously there was no case left, so the Attorney General dropped the charges, and it was formally dropped just May 21st recently. But let's just look at what's happened to Sergeant Corrigan in the past 2 years. First of all, he's been under the court, conditions of his arrest, his parole are bail, I would say.
Yeah.
Conditions
Bail,
of his
yeah.
bail, his release. He has to go into the court for a drug test once a week. He has to report once a week. He can't own firearms. He can't possess firearms, which obviously is a problem if you're in the military.
Yeah.
I mean, so all of these things he's had to do. Not to mention his legal costs. Not to mention This is a man who we started with was having nightmares about being in Iraq because he had some conditions, something related to PTSD. And that's how this whole thing started. And then throw him in a jail for 2 weeks without any contact with the outside, without a phone call, without a lawyer. I mean, that'll set you back, I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
and it's incredibly traumatizing to this man. He's obviously moved out of DC. Top all of this off, at the hearing where I was in May, at the end of it, when they finally dismiss all the charges, Gardner says to the judge, well, he'd like to have his guns back now, his property back. You've had it for 2 years. And the judge said, well, we can't give it back to him because he'll be breaking the same law, unregistered guns. And Gardner said, well, he lives in Virginia. And then the judge says, well, how would he get them? And Gardner said, there's 2 ways. We know this now. Your police department can transfer it to another police department, which is one way. Or a second way is he can legally transport them, because if he goes to the police department, that's a way he can legally carry, in a place he can carry, and he'll take him to Virginia, and that's legal transport. Well, the judge was, not not expecting that, like, neat little tie up in a bow. You've no
Right.
reason to keep this man's guns anymore. So he gave the prosecution 3 days to file a reason not to, and they did. And what they used was the reasons that they opposed release of these guns. They used the exact same reasons that were thrown out in court. They used the smell of natural gas and the booby traps. It basically sound like the man's a terrorist. And so they have not released his guns. They're not releasing his property back to him. He's done nothing, and they're using things that were already thrown out in court. And Richard Gardner's lawyer said he's like, I thought it was so unethical what they did. Lawyers knowingly put before the court stuff they knew to be false information.
Yeah.
So he filed something, saying this is unethical and you need to release this man's property. The judge hasn't ruled, and you know how DC is with they take your guns, they never give them back. So we're still waiting for the answer on that.
That is unbelievable. I mean, are there any? Is there any interest or concern among the DC City Council about this? I know that you've been able to talk with councilors about DC's gun laws in general,
Right.
and they have said, "Oh, we're going to change this," and they still have not taken up the emergency bill.
Well, they
Have they?
Well, things have changed in DC since I was last year.
Yes, we've had another
some
indictment,
changes,
haven't we?
yes.
And a resignation.
Well, we've had
and,
the chairman of the DC City Council, who, as you know, I took shooting for the first time and actually thought I had a really good convert there because he loved it. He had a great Kwame Brown. He had a great time shooting, and now he's, I guess, going to jail or. He's since resigned.
Well, at least he got to go to the
Past
range
week.
before he became possibly a felon. And,
Right, so
lost
he
his...
won't say he's the only person in jail who hasn't shot a gun. We've actually did him a favor. Unfortunately, it's not so great for those of us on the Second Amendment rights in D.C. because we did lose somebody, the only person in City Council I think has shot a gun. So it looks like Phil Mendelson is going to be City Council chair, at least interim. And he's
not...
the one who wrote all these gun laws.
Oh.
I mean, I will say that he has always been, Phil Mendelson, open-minded, and so has he and his staff. Whenever I've gone to him and said, this is what's going on, for example, I said to him, they are not giving out the proper information on transporting guns in D.C. They're putting the wrong stuff on their website and the wrong stuff in the laws. He wrote a very strong letter to the police department and says, I want this changed immediately. I want to see results. So, and that's all him. So, he's not somebody who wants to give us carry rights in D.C. And
no.
I don't think he'll be fighting for the rights of soldiers. But when he wrote a law and it's being implemented unfairly, at least we know that he will, make sure that it's fairly. And I'd like to think that what's going to happen in the case of how the veterans are being treated in D.C. is, now Sergeant Corrigan is suing the city. Mm-hmm. So it's in federal court, and it's he's suing for $500,000. And I think, that's the one thing that DC does listen to, is they listen to the courts, and that's the Heller decision is what gave us our rights to keep arms, and hopefully another decision will give us right to bear arms. And I think the way they're treating our veterans and people who are like carrying guns for their job, hopefully will let them wake up a little bit. And I think this case will probably do very well considering the evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, Emily, thank you again for coming in studio tonight. It's always a pleasure to get a chance to talk with you. And
It's fun to
please
be here.
keep up the fantastic reporting, will you?
Thank you. I will.